My name is Cheryl, and I am very happy to welcome you here today to talk about positive work culture. And I'm so happy to have our esteemed panelists with us today. We have Patsy Dorr from Thomson Reuters and Pat Mulligan from Mercer, and we have Lucy on the far left from the Brunswick Group, and we have James from Oppenheimer Funds. They all have a wealth of experience, and I hope you'll take a look at their bios so that you can really appreciate the kind of understanding that they're going to bring to this issue. But I want to start backing up a little bit. I think we all do want to work in a place that has a positive work culture. But what we've heard over the earlier sessions today and even last night is that many of us have just assumed that better together is better together. So I want to sort of start off probably with you, James, just asking you a little bit, coming from Oppenheimer, how much do you have to make a case internally these days that better together is better together?
I think it's a conversation that really needs to be had. I don't think we can make any assumptions there. I think over, especially the last year, with things in the news, violence in the news, or whether it's election results, we've had to come back and really feel the need to reinforce that message. And I think it's a message that opens up a conversation when you state that case for unity.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if we can bring you in on this to see whether or not you think also that we've had to back up a bit since some of these elections around the world.
I think it's a really great question to ask to rebase the argument, and I think it predates the elections around the world. Open for Business, which is the coalition for business that I'm representing here, came together really to capture the case that open, diverse, inclusive societies are better for business and are better for economic growth. But the point was to be making the case precisely because there are lots of places in the world where the legislation believes people are not making that case. Yeah. So we were trying to equip people to make the case, especially when they don't feel the confidence to bring all the evidence together themselves. We have to prove that it's real to develop innovation and to develop inclusiveness as a route forward to progress.
And if you were to put together what the central argument is for that best case, what are the facts that you use to back that up?
Well, we had the most marvelous time bringing together really the most comprehensive, the most up-to-date amount of research that has been done on this. We created very little ourselves. We actually brought together what was there. But crucially, what we were doing was structuring it around 3 levels. So we were saying, in the first place, there is evidence, lots of evidence, that individuals who feel in one form or another they have to cover up who they are at work are not motivated. They do not bring themselves to work in the best way. That's bad for them and that's bad for the businesses. So we gathered all of that evidence from around the world, which was very fragmented but very powerful. You put that together with the fact that almost all businesses today say they need to drive innovation. And there's a huge amount of evidence that to drive innovation, you need diversity. And you put that together with the fact that countries are competing on a global stage. And even countries where today you're seeing the rise of nationalism, seeing the rise of protectionism, what they are doing is trying to stand up as nations to compete on a global stage. So whether or not we believe in globalization in the way it's been configured to now, countries believe they have to be able to compete globally. And so one way and another, you have to stitch together the case in business, the case for individuals, and the case for countries, and put it together and prove that if you can be open and diverse and inclusive, you can succeed in this world.
Yeah. Thank you. Patsy, let's bring you in on this, working for a major multinational company. Are you seeing that you have to make the case where you are?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for us, when we started down this path about 5 years ago now, when I took on the role, we actually created the diversity and inclusion function globally, as I said, 5 years ago. And very recently, 2 years ago, brought in sustainability and community investment as well. And I tell you that because we started with the business case. And there's no doubt that the discussion around the business case has changed dramatically, in my view, over the past 5 years. I think the research is out there. The statistics are very, very clear. There's no doubt. And I can cite millions of studies, as we all can, including Lucy's study that we recently joined in on, that at the end of the day, diversity in leadership teams within organizations drives innovation, productivity, and the bottom line. And so when we started down this path, the initial conversation we had with our CEO CEO, our customers, and our employees was, this is why we're doing this. This is not a soft issue. There's nothing soft about it. At the end of the day, we're running a business, and we want people to show up at work as their full selves, and we know that that ultimately, as I said, drives engagement and productivity.
Terrific. And Pat, as the leader of When Women Thrive, I'm sure that you also have been building what that case looks like. Tell us a little bit about it from your vantage point.
Yeah, look, I think in prepping, we had a good conversation about, I think great companies who innovate and grow are not asking the question about diversity and inclusion. What they're asking again is, do I have it right? Certainly, and it'll be interesting to get views from the audience, but we have never seen the emphasis on class and economics as a component of diversity and inclusion. I think the turmoil has reopened the conversation about, I think we're quite good at thinking about gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, aging, I mean, all the categories, but we're getting a lot more questions about, from an economic and social perspective, are people thriving? And I would just add that given the changing nature of work and all of the impacts of the technology changes, we think it's a great opportunity to challenge that, because the traditional definitions of education, degrees, credentials, I think are actually quite open. I actually do think great organizations have built the case.
What do you mean when you say that degrees and certifications are open?
Look, I certainly get the great opportunity to work around the world, leading companies, in Asia, in Germany, in the UK, in the US are saying, I can't afford to have as strict definitions of criteria for roles and competencies. I mean, they're just saying that, look, I've got to find the best people around the world, and I want to have a culture that actually doesn't limit that purely based by credentials. So obviously you need experiences, you need to prove that you're capable, but I'm actually quite optimistic that from a social and class perspective, if we can take some of the biases out of how we select people for roles, we'd have a more diverse and inclusive culture.
Right.
So
yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. I'd love to get you in on that. Do you think that at Oppenheimer, such a large corporation, that they're loosening some of the standards to allow for a wider applicant pool to be able to actually filter in?
I absolutely. I mean, look, we're looking at this from all angles right now. We're very early in our journey. We've just started our official sort of diversity and inclusion department just over 1 year ago today. So, it's a process for us, but we're definitely starting to open up the definitions a little bit to see if we can leverage some other untapped resources.
So in just the first year in this office, tell us some of the actual strides. Put us in the room at what are some of the new decisions or some of the new qualifications that you're assessing.
You know what, we really, one of the most important things for us was that we didn't want to just be responsive to buzzwords in the news. Things like some of the words we've all used on this panel already. Yeah. But those words outside of a strategy just become a laundry list of things that are much less impactful.
Like which words?
Exactly, and exactly. And one of the things I really wanted to make sure was that anything we were doing, any initiative, any class that we were running, whatever that was, that everybody knew exactly why they were in that classroom, what the outcomes were supposed to lead to, and how that tied to our broader strategy, and then to our business strategy, of course, too. So I've been very thoughtful in those early days this year to build a strategy and really to communicate that to all of the organization. We built a very foundational strategy focused on 4 key pillars of talent, brand, culture, and client. And for these first couple of years, these are the lenses that we're going to be looking through as we start to build out some of the more specific strategies. Now, one of the things we're also doing in each of our departments is we've created diversity committees. And these are by nomination. These are led by the department head, which reports to the CEO. They'll be working with me as well as their HR partner to create what's called a diversity business plan. Now, that plan just reflects the commitment and the items that the group has identified that are going to help to move the needle within that specific department. And then, of course, by nature of having this plan, we have our department head tracking progress, talking about the wins, how they're making strides to our CEO. So then you're embedding that accountability element from the beginning. And that's some of the biggest things that I would say we've tackled right away from a foundational perspective.
Lucy, let's get you in on this. A lot of this must sort of resonate with you. How do you understand this, the talent, brand, culture, client, and this idea about having diversity as almost a reporting structure within different business units?
I think it has to be that if you're trying to embed it within an organization, it has to have that reporting structure and the picture of diversity unfolds in front of people. I think one of the things that's really interesting, and Pat, you were mentioning it as we were coming up to the platform, is that which kind of diversity at any given moment you're looking at actually is informed by the attitude to inclusion that drives the whole of it. Right. And for us, in putting the research together that we did for Open for Business, one of the things that struck me most is that the businesses today that are really on the case with LGBT are probably the businesses that have been already on the case either with ethnicity or with women or both, and that increasingly now, as economic rifts happen across Europe and America, companies are beginning to say, well, what about socioeconomic diversity? It's all coming from the same place. And once you have a company that is prepared to look at that question, it doesn't matter which facet of it you're looking at. And the companies with the longest history and the greatest strength are prepared quickly to move to the next variety of it, which needs specific attention.
And I think it's important, if you don't mind my jumping in, I think, to Lucy's point, the narrative is so important, right? So it isn't necessarily about lowering standards, which was mentioned earlier. I think it's more about saying, and we define diversity as diversity of thought, style, experience, and approach, right? You're really just trying to cast the widest net to get the best people into the organization. And two people may look exactly the same and bring entirely different experiences to the table. So I really think that narrative is really important. And then to pick up on Lucy's comment as well, if you don't mind, for us as part of our effort, and then James I know as well at Oppenheimer, it's really critical to get that balance between diversity and inclusion right? So you can bring in all these diverse people, but as we all know, and I know many of you know this as well, if the culture doesn't support it, it's not going to work. So we've got to really make sure that at the same time as bringing in the diverse talent, developing the talent, we're also building that culture by educating our managers and our leaders on what it means to identify and build diverse teams and welcome people into the organization.
So you raise an interesting point, though, so I'd like you to just continue for a minute. You talked about the term narrative, right? I mean, diversity and inclusion does mean potentially different things to different people. How do you, and are you looking for a uniform construction for how that's understood and interpreted, or is this something where there is some flexibility at the individual unit level where they can sort of decide what to them they think it should look like?
Okay, so I'll answer that in a couple of different ways, but get to the point rather quickly. I think at the end of the day, it's a multifaceted answer. So we're in an interesting position because, as many of you know, Thomson Reuters, we're a data company. We're partly a news organization. We're information management and data. So we have two responsibilities as applies to diversity and inclusion. One is building our own culture within the organization, and the other is to provide that data, those analytics to other organizations to help them determine how well they're doing in this space. And I tell you that because what that means is that the definition of diversity might vary by company, by organization, by part of the globe. So we try to build in that flexibility. Internally, we've got a global strategy, but we have a variation by about 20% per region, per country, per business unit. And externally, we're trying to drive a consistent definition around diversity that applies more broadly. And I'll give you an example. We recently launched, and I have to bring this up because as you guys know, we're very excited about it. We just launched a couple weeks ago a diversity and inclusion index, which basically identifies the top 100 countries around the globe, all industry, all aspects of diversity, and identified 23 variables that determine exactly what those factors are that drive success in that area. And so that's another way to really engage people, getting back to the narrative and the definition around diversity and inclusion as a broader concept and what it means globally to different types of organizations.
I want to bring you in on this, and I also want to ask you, I think the idea of an index is very interesting, and I hope each of you will address, do you think an index is really something that can measure something like this well? It seems a little tricky.
Like, in all respect to indices, there are more indices measuring different, and they're all different, and they're all amazing. Our experience is what gets measured matters, especially if it's not an HR metric, it's a business metric. So one of the things, the fastest transformation I've ever seen in an industry is the U.S. technology sector. Why? Why did diversity and inclusion become such a business priority in the tech industry? Because two companies publicly reported every element of their diversity index,
Right.
and including transparency on pay equity for every diverse population. Well, once Intel does it, and once another great company does it, well, the pressure to be transparent and for the CEO and those senior executives to say, this data isn't something HR does, this data drives my business strategy. The movement, I'm actually quite optimistic that if you can integrate it into the business and not make it something, in all due respect, and I know you agree with this, that HR and chief diversity officers do, you'll see the movement, particularly if it's tied to customer centricity and innovation. So we see clients go on that journey to start out from an HR and governance perspective, then they certainly look at every element of regulatory compliance, but then they'll get a senior team that says, this is really all about showing up against my customers with the most diverse population I can have because I'm going to be dramatically more innovative. But, and I think the pressure is going to come from the investor community. I just came back from a major pension conference, Mercer, obviously large actuarial. CalPERS and CalSTRS in the US are going to require in 2017 diversity analytics reporting. So once you have to report it, your CEO reports it, and your investor community reports it, I do think what gets measured matters a lot. So
I would love to add to that too. I have to say, just in the last year of being at Oppenheimer Funds, I've had the opportunity to meet with some of our biggest institutional clients, and I've been very surprised at the level of sophistication and details that they're looking for. First of all, the fact that they asked to meet me is an important thing. It could be an RFP, right? It could be a piece of paper that I send to them, but they actually want to sit down with the management team to really talk about what it is that we're doing. And the questions are very, very specific. Things like, what are you doing for Latino women in your community? What about internally? What kind of career development opportunities are you creating for them? Do you have a Latino women's business resource group or employee network? So these are very specific questions, and I think that really says a lot about the value that our clients place on the work that we're doing internally and externally.
Right. If I may pick up on that too, just a couple of thoughts. First of all, I don't think diversity is an HR issue. I think, to your point, I fully agree with you. It's a business issue, and I think it's really important that we stress that. And I think it's unfortunate, frankly, when diversity and inclusion. Sorry, I'll be the difficult one on the panel today. But when diversity functions sit kind of as standalone functions buried in HR, right? You've got to be part of the dialogue. You've got to be in the business, having these discussions, and with your customers, as James mentioned. I think it's really critical. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, it's a fact that I find fascinating, and I know you'll know this very well, but this whole concept of the investor community focusing on these areas. I heard a statistic recently that 70% of all assets under management globally within the next 2 decades, and by the way, this is about $60 trillion US, are going to be in the hands of millennials and women in the next 2 decades. So what does that tell us? That's a factoid we need to work with, and that means in general, by the way, women and millennials are more focused on social impact issues, and that means the financial community is going to change. The analysts need to understand this work. They need to understand diversity. They need to understand sustainability and how these all impact investor solutions. So I think, getting back to the original question around the business case and the facts and the statistics, if you can walk around and actually integrate these statistics into the narrative, into the business case, I think you can make a really big impact.
It was striking me that the idea of narrative in the public arena is hugely important, because one of the things we've definitely discovered in Open for Business is actually the power of the voice of the big companies on a global stage. Yeah. And so what was driving Open for Business was the opportunity for big brands to come together and say what they stand up for on this issue. Yeah. And that can truly influence the global arena. And so the index, the investors asking questions, the big voices in the corporate arena saying, we believe that diversity matters, an attitude of inclusion creates creativity, creates innovation, creates competitiveness, can actually help influence those arenas and those companies who haven't yet taken this on board. Right. So sometimes I'm asked, well, what difference can you make inside an organization? But actually a huge difference a big company can make inside its own organization is to stand up in the public arena for the ideas, and that actually creates an impetus throughout the organization to believe that the CEO, the leadership team, is behind it.
So you've put us exactly where I wanted to be right now, so I really appreciate you mentioning that.
No problem.
I'd like all of you to discuss a little bit about the growing place for CEOs and for business leaders to have more of an impact in the changing role that organizations can play in promoting tolerance and inclusion, and also how this plays into the fact that regulators have been very interested as well in how companies are faring. So who would like to take that?
I'll start, and maybe we can all build on it. Look, my hypothesis is CEOs are not our problem. They're quite visible, they're vocal, they're talking, they're publishing. I would challenge you that their executive teams right below them are not aligned. As we really look at this issue and say, how could you have this person running this business with this kind of data around diversity and inclusion? One of the trends that is actually happening to me in a very quick pace is actually building into leadership assessment models the ability to attract and run and lead a diverse and inclusive team. In the past, there was no accountability. If you actually provided the data and said, look, you've got a group of diverse employees, they're turning over at a higher rate than this group of employee. Your engagement scores for that population are significantly lower. Was there anyone held accountable? So I'm seeing great companies that have led now saying, you can't run this business with this kind of data. And if you're not able to lead differently, multi-source feedback on leaders. If your team doesn't actually think that I can bring my full self to work, the questions about, is this culture and my leader modeling with his or her team this style?
I think you might be hitting on a professional development issue, right? Because I think to a certain extent, as people are really expected to handle managerial capabilities in a way that really does promote a positive work culture, what does that mean in terms of the actual training as people are coming up through the pipeline so that they're really ready to carry the mantle? And if the department hasn't looked like a very inclusive place or is losing some of these key people of difference, how is it that they can then make the claim and actually show that they want to be able to change the complexion of the department?
Maybe a way of looking at that is to turn that thought upside down, because I see exactly what you mean. How does a senior leader, not necessarily the CEO who's out there anyway, but a senior leader, actually decide how to act? If you think of how businesses develop their strategies, they connect with the outside world. So like you were saying, Patsy, where will investment be? Where will money be in 25 years? Who are your customers today? What trends are you seeing in the marketplace? The reasons for driving in this direction are very often outside a business. Mm-hmm. And I think if what you're trying to do is help senior leaders set a different kind of culture, set a more inclusive culture, the way to do it is to tap into the trends in the outside world. One of the things that actually kicked off the initiative that became Open for Business was people saying, there is a real polarization in the world today. There are some places which are becoming more inclusive and where law is allowing people to live much more openly in an LGBT community. There's other places where people are being thrown from the roof and dragged from their beds. Right. How can we have this gulf? And so the opportunity was to produce evidence for people who perhaps hadn't thought about it like that, who hadn't seen that challenge, to actually believe that there was an argument to make that it shouldn't be that way. And to get that evidence into the hands of people who wanted to make a case for it. And that's where you began this conversation. How do you get the evidence to make a case? I think it isn't so much that we need to look downwards and inwards. We need to look upwards and outwards and see that the world is changing and that the organizations need to change to reflect that. I think if you just go downwards and inwards into an organization, you won't make the change fast enough.
I couldn't agree more, actually, and I think it points out another bullet point I would just like to highlight, which is the power of the collective, right?
Yeah,
and Open for Business is a perfect example, right? So we, like Oppenheimer, and I know other organizations as well, and many of you, I'm sure, are involved with a lot of different organizations, whether it may be Out Leadership or whether it's UN Women, and there's a variety of other organizations that we've signed on to, probably about 50 around the globe. The point being that, to your point, Lucy, you're getting access to the data in a collective way where you can dig in where you see fit and apply differently in certain locations, regions, and countries and things of that nature. But you're also sharing a collective voice, because you're right. I mean, there's so much we can do internally, and we want to do that, and we need to do that, and the pressure is there to do that. But the more that we can work together, I think, as organizations, and I think today more than ever, to your point, Lucy, as well, I'll reiterate it, I think it's our responsibility as global organizations to get out there and share that voice of the people, if you will, and really make that impact.
Very interestingly, that voice isn't built just on opinion. I happen to want to say this. It's built on organizations like your own, and I'm sure many of the in the room, which have long experience of building inclusive cultures, long understanding of the business case for doing it and the merits and the driving innovation this way and so forth. So when we're seeing 22 big brands now as part of Open for Business, they didn't just happen to want to speak up. They have experience and track record to bring to the party, to bring to the evidence. So one organization by itself is only speaking its opinion. A collective voice is actually setting a context within which change can be made.
Absolutely.
So Lucy, I guess the only thing I would flag just to be a little bit more pessimistic is the data. I'll pick one diverse population, right? Women. The data is pathetic. I mean, when you really look at what we look at, the internal labor market in these organizations, we look at the attraction, the promotion, the retention, and the pay of this population. We will not achieve gender equality in most of our lifetimes. So what I struggle with is what we did in the past is actually not going to change those future trajectories. And I actually think it takes the analytics that you apply to other core business processes to say, look, we really need to understand where do our women and other diverse populations get stuck? Why is it that we're hiring more women at a professional level than men, and yet the entry-level manager level in most industries, it switches immediately. We call it, kind of our little pipeline, stovepipe, right? Well, why do women leave at twice the rates of men in many of these roles? I would just challenge that. And I think, James, great for you to build on this. We all did the programs. We all did the let's talk about this, let's convene. Actually, those programs and those practices, while well-intentioned, are not changing the outcomes and certainly not changing the representation. And if they're not changing it for women, why are we confident they're going to change it for other diverse populations? And I think, James, your approach to say, look, we've got to have a very different strategy it's very data-based about why is it that our diverse populations don't progress the way we want. So I'm just struggling that I think we're all doing a lot of well-intentioned things, but if you actually look at the outcomes, they're really not changing the future representation of diverse populations above the middle manager level.
So it's interesting you say that, and I want to bring you in, because today in the Wall Street Journal, 2 companies that have increased their stated goals for having women in their workforce, it was Salesforce, I think it was also eBay, basically said, we're not going to hit those targets, we're not even close, and yet they have been sort of following the path that you all have been setting out, and they certainly agree that they want to have an inclusive workplace. So would you weigh in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of touch base on, because I think the data, and I agree with you that we're doing a lot of training and things we've done in the past. One of the things I think we haven't fully leveraged yet is the role of empathy, though, in our strategy. Because I think when you can connect, and we can show data to folks, I think it's all very important, it's all necessary, but I think one of the things that we have not done as good a job on is talking about empathy. When you can create and engineer an experience where an individual is able to connect to a demographic that's different from who they are, it changes the way that you look at that demographic in the future. I just went to a conference a few weeks ago with 200 women of color. Carla Harris from JP Morgan was the lead speaker there, and I was one of the only men in the room, probably the only man in the room, and the only white one at that. And I have to say, to be there in that room and experience that with them, the narrative, the conversation, the way they talked about their experiences, their career goals, how, regardless of how I thought their experiences were, I thought they had great jobs, their experiences day to day was different than my own perceptions. And to hear them talking collectively and freely around people who were like them, it was powerful. And I did walk away, and this happens to me a lot, I walk away thinking very differently and questioning some of my own behavior, some of my own decision making, some of my own perceptions. And I believe that begins when we start with engineering those experiences where empathy can happen.
And I think to build, if you don't mind, a quick thought on that, I think, I keep jumping in. I'll just keep jumping in. But to build on that point, though, I think what really has to happen is we have to change the discussion. We have to have a real discussion, to your point. I couldn't agree with what you said more. But to actually avoid, for many, many years, and this is my humble, or maybe not so humble opinion, honestly, anymore. I mean, I think we've been afraid, particularly in the US, but I'd say in other parts of the globe, to have real discussions about these issues. So, for example, we just launched a Black Talent Program. We are calling it just that. We do not have enough Black talent in our leadership positions in our organization on a global basis. So we are openly talking about this issue. We brought in a professor, I know you all are doing the same, to talk about how difficult it is to have these types of conversations, but if you don't have them, you're not going to cause change. So you've got to have that empathy factor, and you've got to be empowered, I think, and it takes time. None of this is easy, right? I'm not suggesting it's, rectified overnight, but to encourage people to really talk about, to your point, how they're feeling and what we really need to do about this, and that there are real things out there. We all know about unconscious bias. We've been talking about it for years, but there's more than that. There's microaggressions, right? There are behaviors in our culture that are much, much more subtle that people don't necessarily pick up on. So let's talk about them and address them.
I agree with you completely, because I think also, just to get to some of those more in-depth conversations, sometimes people don't even have the vocabulary, or they have it, but they don't know what words that they can use in the workplace.
Right.
I mean, we've used a couple of words on this panel that I know the first time I used those words, and other organizations I've worked with in the past, there was a little bit of a pause, like, okay, we're using that word now, right? And to really help people to feel comfortable talking about things that I know they talk about outside the workplace. I think there's a lot of power in that, to give people the freedom and the safe space, and also the knowledge that what happens if you use the wrong word? I do that all the time. I'm always trying my best. Sometimes people call me Jim versus James, and I like James better, right? So we'll have a little conversation. They got the word wrong. We had a nice little talk. We got it right, and then they call me James from that point forward, right? That's the way it works. Let's make this a little bit more simple. But we do try to talk about that, because I think that fear is such a huge element and blocks people from having the conversations that they need to have so that we can evolve. And if we can acknowledge that fear is always going to be there and not let that be a barrier, I think we can be more successful.
And I think you can also give people permission to talk. Through the evidence. So I would completely agree with your point, Pat, earlier. We don't have enough data on various things. And in fact, one of the really exciting things about having done the first data gathering for Open for Business is that it leads to, where's the gap, where's the next data gathering? And one of the things that it was aimed to do was to kickstart conversations in places where it's practically dangerous to have the conversation. So we've had roundtables now in India, in Hungary, and actually bringing people around a table where they're looking at each other and saying, are we able to talk about this? And the data in the report is giving them a place to connect and a place to discuss the issue for the first time. A lot of it is permissioning people and equipping them, as well as allowing them. So I think the combination of data and connection and permission actually sets a new conversation, reframes the debate. And that's, I think, what needs to happen. Otherwise, we're simply speaking to ourselves from people who already agree.
And one friend is going to be technology. I just want to comment. I mean, I think, again, we don't, technology and how, is artificial intelligence things going to impact, sourcing and talent acquisition. So some of the best now SaaS platforms that help you take the biases out of how do you select people for jobs? You think you're objective, you take the names off the top of the resume. We've looked at Mercer at how do diverse populations write their resumes? What kind of nouns do they use? Especially now when you're saying the first source of assessing that is actually going to be another technology platform. We found that women and white women and black women and Latino women write contributory verbs. I contributed, I gathered, I helped. And men write, I came, I saw, I conquered. Whether they really came, saw, or conquered or not. So how can the technology help? It can take a resume and take all of those words out and say, let's actually put all of these same resumes through the same platform, and actually say, we saw in one investment management firm in Boston the application for a primarily male team go up 40% in 6 months by actually using the technology to take out the biases in the resumes. So I think part of it is we can have the conversation, we can do, but sometimes the way we run these processes is not our friend, and I'm super optimistic about, the technology that can help, and really, getting managers who say, look, I think we're well-intentioned, we've done unconscious bias training, we're still have 3 times as many of this population applying, and I know they're out there, why are we not selecting them? Well, maybe it's because you actually have biases in other ways that you're not, you're really not familiar with. So I think that could really help if we're open to using technology differently. I don't know.
I completely agree. And it's interesting, there was a discussion last night about how technology is impacting the role of humans for artificial intelligence, et cetera. It's a great discussion, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's an additional resource for us to have access to, which I couldn't agree with you more. I would add another data point that I'm sure many of you have heard before, which I think is interesting, and this is more gender related, but something we have to factor in as well, in addition to how resumes are described or verbalized, is that when a woman looks at a job description, on average, I'll say that again, if they will apply for the job, if they feel they meet 90% of the criteria, right? Men, 50 to 60%. So right there, you've got a data point that's fascinating, right? And so you've got to kind of get out there and say, listen, take a risk here. So how do you write that JD as well before you even get to the resume? And when you actually get to the conversation to encourage these women, in this case, to actually go for these roles. And I think that will also be helpful in terms of changing the dialogue, utilizing the technology as well.
We see these same challenges or things that you're raising in the performance process as well. Just in the writing of the performance goals and how they reflect on those toward year end. Sometimes the language is what was the word you used?
I came, I saw, I conquered.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that one.
It's that.
So you've talked a lot about making sort of safe spaces. So I just want to bring in, how do you think about different avenues or the benefit of having people raise concerns in the workplace without sort of the worry of reprisal? How do you create a culture where someone would come forward with a concern, be it a whistleblower or other, you mentioned microaggressions? How do you send the message that that's okay too?
I mean, I'm happy to start, and Lucy, if you want to build on, I'm sure we'll all build on each other. This is going to sound very trite, but I mean it wholeheartedly. I mean, you got to just tackle this issue from every angle. I mean, we look at our diversity and our inclusion strategy, right? This gets back to our comments around the balance between diversity and inclusion, right? So you've got to be building the culture at the same time as putting the programming in place for the talent, but you've also got to be educating those managers. And to build off your point earlier, which I thought was a great one, the issue is not at the CEO level. It's at middle management levels. And if you look at any global multinational company, we're 55,000 people in 100 countries, right? Middle management for us is 15,000 people. It takes a long time to impact the mindsets and the actions of 15,000 people. So I think you really have to have a holistic, and again, I don't mean to sound trite, but a holistic strategic approach to attack this from every angle, from the bringing in of the talent, to development, to advancement, to building the culture, to holding people accountable. I mean, you've got to have those in place with the performance management system. And also, and I'm not suggesting naming and shaming, but one of the things that we've done, which is a bit of naming and shaming, I guess I am suggesting it, in the sense that we're actually holding our business units accountable for, they must have X amount of diverse slates for any role, right? Absolutely. A lot of companies are doing that. But we're also now taking it to the next level, and I think a lot of companies are doing this too, but where we're actually looking at turnover in the sense of how many of those diverse slates actually turn into diverse hires. So I think all of this is moving into the next phase, but you got to attack it from both angles, or all angles, if you will. One more point, and then I'll pass it back to you, Lucy. What we've also found is that, we've been at this for 5 years, as I said, and mostly focused on the holistic aspect, but there's also the surgical aspect. As these senior level hires are being put in place, who's in the room with the senior leader, the CEO, or the next level down, or any leader actually making that decision? And we need to make sure that we have those practices in place, that those individuals are being challenged. So I'll stop there.
Lucy, well, I think I would be very happy to say I would pick up and said a lot of that. Yep. I think that you and indeed others on the panel, and I hope others in the room, whilst you say the CEOs isn't where the problem is, I would say, yes, but if you can be so confident in that, the CEOs are a great asset. Yep. So the leadership, I think, is an asset. Everything you describe is to drill down, to make it happen, and believe you me, I wouldn't take a single detail away from that. Yeah. But I do genuinely believe that it is set by the leadership.
Yeah.
And it is set in the language, the demeanor, and the attitude. If it is only ticking the boxes of the number of hires, here we are in London. The Metropolitan Police is a famous example of, how many of this kind of person or this kind of person have we got? Nothing to do with the attitude of the police force. Right. So attitude is enormous, and the signals are sent by the leadership. And that's why the word inclusion matters so much. Is your attitude inclusive? From that flows the diversity.
All right, so you've also just touched on where I was going next, which is, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the flip side. Some companies today are values-based organizations. If you think in the United States of the Hobby Lobby decision or some of the stories that came out about Chick-fil-A, where they stand on what they consider to be religious beliefs. And I'm wondering, is there still room for companies to carve out space that may have individual beliefs that don't fully want to have a very diverse and multicultural workforce, or don't want to put forth values that support those beliefs?
I'll take it. I'll start. I know you guys are going to jump in.
No, go, James.
No, you know what? I don't know about the companies that you mentioned. I can't really speak to those. However, what I can speak to is the fact that, we really value inclusion and equality. And we're, really looking at more ways in which we can speak to that in a public way. Again, this is just barely over a year in our journey. We have spoken out already on a couple of issues externally. We have just scored 100% on the Corporate Equality Index, announced just yesterday, so we're very excited about that. That I also see that as a way of speaking out about your values in a public space. I think we're early in our journey, and then we're having the right conversations that we need to have so that we can find our voice and be more impactful there.
Look, I've had a number of conversations with all male white leadership teams in certain industries saying, we have diversity of thought. We went to different schools, and I think I think each of us, it's incumbent upon us to say, really. So help me understand. When you're solving a problem, when you're facing up against a customer base that is completely different than you, and look, if those companies can thrive in society and thrive and succeed and not hurt society, let them be. But they're not going to innovate and grow. And so you see great organizations or just comment. Someone like an Apple, from the CEO down saying, look, our customer base looks completely different than we do, and our mission is so diverse and holistic. We care deeply about society, and if we can't build that kind of workforce of the future, can we really execute on our mission? So, everyone's motivated by different things, but I think as long as the winners win because they innovate and they thrive because they're diverse and inclusive, hopefully we won't have to answer that question for long.
I want to bring our audience in about 2 minutes, so I'd love of each of you to give us sort of some closing thoughts as Brexit plays out over the next year and a Trump presidency takes over in the United States. What are a few of the key things that you are watching that we haven't discussed that we really should keep in mind as all of us want to enjoy where we work?
Right.
And we want to be able to have conversations that address some of the issues of our time.
So this is a topic that I'm personally very passionate about, both in the corporate setting and in my children's schools, frankly. I think particularly in the US, but also in the UK with Brexit, in my humble opinion, I know this is not a political debate, but I do think that a lot of the same reasons drove us to where we are. I think people are in a place where they're angry with government, they're angry with their situations, and they're trying to speak out. So putting that political piece aside, what I've been telling my own team and my own children who have struggled a lot in different ways, regardless of where you sit on the party lines, and that's not the issue at all. It's more about what does this mean for society? And so what I personally think, and I feel very strongly about this, is I think that the role of the corporation now is absolutely critical. It is our responsibility, I see this as my responsibility, our team, our CEO, to play a much more active role in this space, and not just about diversity, but also about social value, social impact, right? And creating a society that allows us to have these conversations. Again, I kind of keep getting back to that point, but I think it's the role of the corporations in a collective fashion that's really going to make the difference in the coming years, and that's the opportunity we've got to seize.
Vigilance. I mean, I think in the U.S. particularly, you know, where we thought we were making progress, whether it was with the White House, pay equity, you know, it's going to take, we're all going to have to really be more vigilant and actually reframe our focus to say, I can't take my eye off that agenda because I take my eye off it and it could be gone. Right. So I think vigilance is critical.
I completely agree. I think vigilance is more important than ever before. I think we have a big job ahead of us, and I think we still need time to process and figure out what this new world looks like. I think in the meantime, what I'm looking to do is to partner with other organizations who are on the front lines, some of my nonprofit partners specifically, who are really on the front lines and can help to bring some of that thought leadership to the table.
Here, give us an example of one of the not-for-profits.
Yes, exactly. We'll be talking later. But also to really, again, work on keeping those lines of communication open.
Lucy.
I would agree with everything that everybody said, and to me, it keeps coming back to you have to connect a company with the landscape in which it's operating. If your customers are changing, the world is changing, the economics on the global platform are changing, it tells you you have to change. And every leadership team I've ever met knows that. So just to keep asserting that and holding that as the thing that has to be reflected in your business has to be a positive way forward for the people in the business and for the countries you serve.
Terrific. I'd like to bring our audience in. I think we have somebody walking around.
Oh, good question.
Hi. Sorry. This is Shelley Kapoor-Collins. And actually, this is for all of you, but James, especially for you. You mentioned Carla Harris with JP Morgan Chase. So I rolled out of the administration earlier this year, and she was my chair on the SBA. So
fantastic.
Thank you. We worked together, and for 3 years, all I did was research on how do we drive inclusion of women in the innovation economy, 100% participants. And what we found was that access to capital was the biggest barrier. Yeah. Right. So based on that and the reports that we did, when I came out of the administration, I decided that enough talk, right? Enough talk and enough research, we need to have a call to action. So we developed a fund. It's a women's fund that actually invests in female entrepreneurs. So my question to you is, how would you partner with organizations that are focused on women to drive diversity? There are so many different groups out there, but would you focus on specific groups like that?
I think it's a great question. I think we're very early in those stages right now. It's going to seem like a non-answer, but I think it starts with a conversation. I'd love to talk with you more about that. Yep. Anybody else?
I mean, I would just add that we worked very closely, for what it's worth, we worked very closely with some fund managers to develop our index, one of whom is based out of Morgan Stanley. I won't mention her name because I'm sure I have permission to do that, but she only invests in funds where there are at least 3 women on a board. So it's a similar concept, right? But I bring that up because we actually engaged in a lot of dialogue with her and other investors who are focusing on that effort specifically, and how can we then develop tools and resources to help them make those decisions and get more access to capital accordingly. Absolutely.
Thank
Fantastic.
you. We'll move on to the next question.
My name is Kate Zhao. I'm from Fosun International. We're a Shanghai headquartered company, but now we own lots of assets globally. For example, in UK, we are one of the big shareholders of Thomas Cook. In France, we own Climate, and in the US, a couple of assets as well. So one of the diversity question is we actually acquired a diverse pool of talents, not built step by step. So, and there's also an Western meets Eastern culture shock during the transaction and after the transaction. So we see a very interesting and powerful group of talents. They're with very different backgrounds. However, we don't know the right way to be more emergent into that. I don't know if you guys have more suggestions. We've run an internal campaign called GLOCAL, which is global plus local, means when you do globalization, you need to do localization in different regions as well. But the question is, people don't get it suddenly, right? So instead of just giving a slogan, is there any tangible suggestions you can be given? Thank you.
I'm happy to comment on that one as well quickly, and then we'll pass over. So cultural fluency is a very sort of common practice in diversity and inclusion these days. In fact, it's a pretty hot topic, right? The more global our companies are getting. I personally spent 5.5 years in Asia and spent a lot of time on this topic of educating our leaders on a global basis as to what those cultural differences were and how do you appreciate the leadership and the relational skills of the Eastern culture versus the Western culture. That's a personal perspective, which we can always elaborate on, but from a corporate perspective in terms of what we do in this is we see this all the time, and it is a real issue, and this happens particularly for us and perhaps my colleagues as well in developing markets where we're seeing that, we send all these expats out there. I was one of them. I was one of them who went out to Asia, to drive this culture change, and then you're not yet building the local leadership around that. So one very specific tool that we use is the whole concept around educating people about cultural fluency. And so there's a specific tool called Culture Wizard, if you may be familiar with it. It's one of the better ones out there, in my opinion, right? It's online, it's easy, it's simple to use, but if you debrief it properly, you can actually learn quite a bit from it. And the more you can kind of push that out to the community, that certainly helps raise awareness around what those differences are.
And just to build, one of the things we're seeing is it's being highly integrated in the merger and acquisition process, right? So you shouldn't actually realize you have a super diverse talent pool after you actually make that investment. Yes. Our suggestion is you should really understand what that asset pool is ahead of time and have a point of view about what, from a governance perspective, what is local, what's global, and how are you actually going to celebrate that diversity and really ensure that you leave some of the inherent biases in the home organization. So things like, we just had 15 Japanese multinationals for 2 days in Silicon Valley. They're buying all of these assets in the U.S. and they come to my client in a jacket, a tie, and it happens to be a great organization like LinkedIn. I'm like, look, they're just not. You're going to have to take the tie off right now because they just. So I think there are some things, showing an interest, going to visit different industries and saying, I'd like to understand what's the employee value proposition in this culture. How does it really work? But I think just showing the passion and interest and saying, I'm going to invest in understanding through that whole process, particularly during the acquisition, I think gives you a lot of credibility when you go forward. So,
may I add one small thought onto that, which is it can be enormously helpful. I'm sure probably you have a form of doing it already, enormously helpful to produce some sort of insight data content which allows people to connect around it. Because as we were discussing earlier, sometimes these things are hard to touch and they're even harder to express. And so people brought together finding it hard to connect culturally almost don't know how to express that difficulty. Where if you can produce some sort of data, some sort of content that expresses the difference in thinking. What are you hoping from this? What are you hoping from that? Some collective project to work around. It's the same principle as the Open for Business data. Let's talk about that thing. That thing makes it easier for people to join in together and find out what will work. Just expecting people to connect is really, really hard. They have to connect around a thing. That's my experience.
We'll take the next question.
This one in the middle. Sure.
Yep.
Hi. Not in the business at all, but I do have a question for the panel.
Could you just say your name and affiliation?
Lieutenant Colonel Rona from the U.S. Air Force, so definitely not my league here. However, I will say, question for you. Do you think the businesses are slower to include diversity because they're afraid of litigation at all? Is there any backlash that they're considering that they... we have not talked about that at all.
Yeah.
And secondly, this diversity dartboard we have, are there solutions? We talk about metrics and goals. What are those based off of? Thank you.
So I probably spend 10% of my time with general counsels, and they are now my new best friend.
Yeah.
So I would share that I think there's a lot of passion, both in Europe and the US, on disclosure and getting general counsels to have confidence that what you disclose with a strategy is better than the math that you shred. So I actually think we're right at the, and I'd love to hear Betsy, your view, or James, right at a breakthrough, that in the past we didn't actually share the data, hold leaders accountable because we were really concerned about, well, what happens if this gets out? We've actually now turned that around and said, you are actually in a much better position if you actually have a workforce strategy, you've got a diversity lens, you know what's happening, you certainly know if you've got a pay or promotion equity problem, and you have a remediation strategy. And you're working against it, and it may take you a number of years. So, I'm more optimistic that if we can get, anybody here a general counsel? get more general counsels and more legal teams involved to say, look, you study the risk. It's a risk worth taking because it actually moves the needle when you share the data. And so I'm feeling like we'll see a lot more, at least we would in the prior.
And once again, you can liken it to other areas. I mean, my experience is if you look now at, let's take something deliberately also controversial and adjacent, environmental policy.
Right.
There's been a long time where companies didn't disclose because they were worried about being beaten up on what they disclosed, and that was the risk. Now the risk is not disclosing. Supply chains, the risk is not disclosing.
Right.
Privacy, the risk is not disclosing. So actually, I think one of the things that has happened in the last 5 years is that the transformation has been towards recognizing that you will be challenged on it, identifying where you are, and having a strategy in place to progress. The answer that doesn't fly these days and is the most risky is, I don't know, we didn't look.
Yep.
Thank you. Next question.
And without sounding corny, I think it's always important to have a pithy statement. So this will be my pithy statement. Hopefully it has an impact. But transparency equals trust. Right. And so I think what we're seeing, and I completely agree with what you're saying. And general counsel, by the way, is also my best friend these days. Corporate affairs and general counsel for that reason, because it's also about how you tell the story, to your point. Because people are always internally in our company, our business resource groups, all sorts of people are constantly asking for data. So my question is, why? What do you need the data for? I'm not saying you can't have the data, but help us understand why you need it so we can actually give it to you in a meaningful way that actually tells a story that's impactful. And then general counsel gets a bit more comfortable with the dialogue and we can all move forward.
Terrific.
Hi, Natalie Mackey from GC Holdings. So we're a small company, and I know that everyone has been talking about these really huge businesses. So we're about 25 employees, and our second largest department is technology, and that is extremely diverse. And it's by nature of the role. I mean, you can go to any school and learn how to code, and if you can code like a demon, you can get a job almost anywhere. So we don't have as much diversity in the rest of the company. And as we're in this really high growth environment, we have a lot of pressure from the funds that have backed us to hire from sort of the best schools. And my question is really for Patty, because you fascinated me with this idea of sort of cognitive diversity and the idea that it doesn't have to just be about credentials. Yeah. So what do you specifically cite when someone is saying, we need to open up this talent pool? We need to not just hire from, ironically, the VC world is extremely homogenous. And I know there's a lot of it should be the most, the most inclusive, but it's sort of, there is a ton of pressure that, did this person go to Wharton? Did they, are we gonna, if we mess up, can we cite that at least this person has this really great credentials? So how do you approach that? And then also, where do you source, how do you open up your hiring practices?
So it has this big red sign that says time up, and that is